In the quiet space before choices take shape, when the heart stands suspended between what it knows and what it desires, the story of Eden rises like a mirror held to the deepest places within us, revealing how easily trust can tremble, how subtly longing can shift, and how profoundly a single moment can echo across the landscape of a life. The garden breathed with a harmony so complete that every movement felt like an extension of peace itself, and Adam and Eve walked within it with the unguarded freedom of those who had never tasted fear or carried the weight of regret. Light filtered through branches heavy with fruit, scattering patterns across the soft earth, and the air carried the scent of life untouched by sorrow. They lived in a world where nothing was hidden, nothing was fractured, and every step felt aligned with the rhythm of the one who had shaped them. Yet even in this perfection, a quiet tension lingered near the tree at the garden center, a boundary drawn not to restrict them, but to preserve the innocence that made Eden whole. Eve approached the tree with the curiosity of someone who had never known danger. Her thoughts unclouded by suspicion, her heart unburdened by doubt. The serpent watched her with a stillness that felt out of place, its gaze sharp with an awareness that did not belong to the purity of the garden. When it spoke, its voice carried a softness that wrapped itself around her thoughts, reshaping the command she had always known into something that felt negotiable, as though the boundary God had set was less a gift and more a limitation. Adam stood nearby, close enough to hear, close enough to intervene, yet caught in the same subtle pull that blurred the clarity of trust. The fruit hung before them, its beauty undeniable, its promise whispered through the serpent's carefully woven words. And in that moment, the garden seemed to hold its breath as their hearts leaned toward a choice that would reshape everything. And if this ancient moment stirs something familiar within you, let that quiet recognition move you to share this journey with someone who may need its weight and wisdom. The fruit rested in Eve's hand with a coolness that surprised her, its surface smooth beneath her fingers, as though it carried within it a secret waiting to be revealed. The serpent's words lingered in her mind, not as a command, but as a suggestion, a gentle reframing that made the boundary God had set feel less like protection and more like withheld possibility. Adam watched her, his expression caught between trust and uncertainty, the air around them thick with a tension they had never known. The garden remained unchanged, yet something within them had begun to shift, a subtle turning of desire towards something that felt both thrilling and unsettling. Eve lifted the fruit, the stem releasing with a soft snap that echoed louder in her heart than in the garden. She hesitated, not out of rebellion, but out of the unfamiliar weight of choice, the kind that presses against the edges of trust. When she tasted it, the sweetness spread across her tongue with a richness that felt almost intoxicating, as though the fruit carried not only flavor, but a promise of something more. She turned to Adam, offering it to him, and he accepted it with a quiet resignation, the bond between them stronger in that moment than the clarity of the command they had been given. As the taste settled within them, awareness sharpened in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Innocence slipped from them like a garment they had never realized they wore. And the garden's harmony trembled as though creation itself sensed the fracture. They felt exposed, vulnerable, suddenly aware of themselves in a way that pierced rather than freed. And in this tremor lies the doorway into the heart of life application. For the story of Eden is not merely about a moment-long past, but about the quiet, subtle ways temptation still approaches us today through whispers that reshape truth, through desires that blur boundaries, through choices that seem small yet carry the weight of transformation. The story of Eden becomes far more than an ancient account when we recognize how closely its movements mirror the quiet struggles that unfold within our own hearts. Because temptation rarely arrives as open rebellion, but as a subtle reframing of what we already know to be true. The serpent's question, "Did God really say?" echoes in the modern mind in countless forms, not as a direct challenge, but as a gentle nudge that shifts certainty into ambiguity. We feel it when a boundary that once felt clear begins to blur under the weight of desire. When a conviction that once felt firm becomes softened by rationalization. When something we know is harmful begins to appear harmless, even reasonable. Eve did not fall because she sought evil. She fell because the serpent made disobedience feel like wisdom, progress, and self-discovery. In the same way, our greatest temptations often disguise themselves as opportunities for growth, freedom, or fulfillment, appealing not to our rebellion, but to our longing to be more than we are. Adam's silence in the moment of temptation reveals another layer of application. For many of our failures do not come from dramatic acts, but from quiet passivity. From standing by when we should speak, from yielding to pressure rather than holding to truth. The story exposes how easily relationships can shape choices, how the desire to remain connected can override the clarity of conviction, and how the fear of disappointing someone we love can lead us into decisions we never intended to make. Temptation, then, is not merely about desire. It is about identity, trust, and the subtle shifts that occur when we begin to believe that God's boundaries are burdens rather than gifts. This first movement of application invites us to examine the whispers that shape our decisions, the quiet moments when truth becomes negotiable, and the ways we justify choices that lead us away from the life we were created to live. And if this reflection opens something meaningful within you, let that stirring guide you to share this journey with someone who may need its clarity and depth. The moment after the fruit was eaten carried a weight that neither Adam nor Eve could have anticipated. A heaviness that settled over them like a shadow stretching across the garden's once unbroken peace. Their eyes opened not to divine wisdom, but to a piercing self-awareness that made them feel exposed in a world that had never before felt threatening. The innocence that once allowed them to stand unashamed now slipped from them like a garment they could no longer hold. And the garden that had always felt like home suddenly felt foreign, its beauty edged with a sharpness they could not name. They reached for fig leaves with trembling hands, trying to cover what had never needed covering, their movements clumsy with the unfamiliar weight of shame. When they heard the sound of God walking in the garden, the voice that once brought joy now awakened fear. Not because God had changed, but because they had. Adam's words trembled with the new language of hiding, and Eve's voice carried the ache of confusion and blame. Each sentence revealing how quickly trust had unraveled into self-protection. The serpent's deception had not only fractured their relationship with God, had fractured their relationship with themselves and with each other, weaving division into the very fabric of their hearts. God's questions were not accusations, but invitations, gentle openings meant to draw them out of hiding. Yet even in his tenderness, they felt the distance their choice had created. The garden seemed to mourn with them, its harmony disrupted, its peace overshadowed by the knowledge that something precious had been lost. And as the consequences unfolded, the story pressed deeper into the human experience, revealing how choices made in moments of temptation can ripple outward, shaping relationships, identity, and the landscape of the soul. And if this moment of unraveling resonates with you, let its weight move you to share this unfolding journey with someone who may need its truth. The story of Eden becomes profoundly practical when we recognize that the patterns revealed in Adam and Eve's experience still shape the way we navigate temptation today. For the dynamics of desire, doubt, and distortion have not changed, even though the circumstances have. Temptation often begins with a subtle shift in perspective, a quiet suggestion that reframes God's boundaries as obstacles rather than protection. We feel it when we begin to believe that fulfillment lies just beyond the line God has drawn. When we convince ourselves that we deserve something that contradicts His wisdom, or when we allow our desires to speak louder than His voice. The serpent's strategy was not to force rebellion, but to reshape perception. And this remains one of the most powerful ways temptation works in our lives. Another layer of application emerges in the way Adam and Eve responded after their choice. For shame often becomes the second temptation, one that leads us to hide, to withdraw, to cover ourselves with excuses. distractions, or self-protection rather than bringing our brokenness into the light of God's presence. Their instinct to hide reveals how easily we can mistake God's approach for judgment rather than mercy, forgetting that His questions are invitations to restoration, not condemnation. The fig leaves they sewed together symbolize the fragile coverings we create to mask our failures, coverings that cannot heal the deeper wounds beneath. The relational fracture between Adam and Eve also speaks into modern life, showing how temptation rarely affects only the individual, but often ripples outward, shaping the dynamics of trust, communication, and connection. When we choose self-protection over honesty, blame over responsibility, or silence over vulnerability, we repeat the patterns that first emerged in Eden. Yet the story also reveals that God meets us even in our hiding, offering not only truth but covering, not only consequence but compassion. This movement of application invites us to examine the ways we respond to failure, the coverings we create to hide our vulnerability, and the relationships affected by our choices. And if this reflection brings clarity to your own journey, let that insight move you to share it with someone who may need its depth and hope. The garden's stillness trembled as God spoke the consequences of their choice, each word carrying both justice and sorrow, as though creation itself grieved the fracture that had entered its heart. Adam and Eve stood before Him, no longer clothed in innocence but wrapped in the fragile awareness of their own brokenness. Their eyes lowered, not out of defiance, but out of the weight of what they had unleashed. The serpent's judgment came first, its momentary triumph overshadowed by a prophecy that would echo through the ages, a promise that one day the deception it had sown would be undone by a Redeemer who would confront temptation not with doubt, but with unwavering trust. Eve listened as her own consequences unfolded, the beauty of life now intertwined with pain, the joy of relationship shadowed by struggle. Yet even in this, there was a thread of hope, for through her lineage, the promise of restoration would one day rise. Adam heard his judgment with a heaviness that settled deep within him, the ground that once yielded freely, now resisting his labor. The harmony of creation strained by the weight of his choice. Yet even in this moment of loss, God's voice carried a tenderness that revealed His heart was not to abandon, but to redeem. Not to sever relationship, but to restore it through a path they could not yet see. When God clothed them in garments of skin, the gesture spoke of both provision and sacrifice, a quiet foreshadowing of a future redemption that would require far more than the life of an animal. The garden's gates stood open for a final moment, the path behind them glowing with the memory of what once was. And as they stepped beyond its boundary, the world before them felt vast, untamed, and heavy with the unknown. Yet even in exile, they carried with them the echo of God's promise, a reminder that failure was not the end of their story. And if the weight of this moment stirs something within you, let that reflection move you to share this journey with someone who may need its hope and depth. The heart of life application emerges most clearly when we recognize that the story of Eden is not merely about humanity's fall, but about the ongoing journey of learning to trust God's wisdom over the shifting desires of our own hearts. Temptation often begins with a question that reframes God's intentions, suggesting that His boundaries limit rather than protect, that His commands restrict rather than guide, that His wisdom withholds rather than provides. When we internalize these distortions, we begin to see obedience as a burden rather than a pathway to life. And the choices that follow reflect a heart that has subtly shifted away from trust. The narrative also reveals that temptation thrives in isolation, in the moments when we rely solely on our own reasoning rather than seeking God's voice or the counsel of others. Eve stood before the tree without turning to God, and Adam stood beside her without speaking. And in their silence, the serpent's voice became the loudest in the garden. This pattern continues today when we face decisions alone, when we silence the voices that call us back to truth, or when we allow desire to drown out the wisdom we already know. The story invites us to cultivate practices of honesty, accountability, and spiritual attentiveness. recognizing that temptation loses much of its power when brought into the light. Yet the most profound application lies in God's response. For He does not abandon Adam and Eve in their failure, but meets them with both truth and compassion. His questions draw them out of hiding. His judgments acknowledge the reality of their choices, and His covering reveals His heart to restore rather than reject. This becomes a model for how we navigate our own failures, not with denial or self-condemnation, but with a willingness to step into God's presence, to receive His covering, and to walk forward with renewed trust. This final movement invites you to see your own story through the lens of Eden, not as a tale of defeat, but as a journey toward restoration. Shaped by a God who meets you even in your hiding and leads you toward healing, wholeness, and renewed trust. The story of Eden lingers as a reminder that temptation, failure, and restoration are woven into the human experience. Yet, even in our most fragile moments, God's invitation to return remains steady and unbroken. And if this journey through the story and its application has stirred something meaningful within you, let that reflection move you to share it so others can walk with you into its depth and hope.